Greetings and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. My name is Gennady Stolyarov II, and I am the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party. Here we hold conversations with some of the world's leading thinkers in longevity, science, technology, philosophy, and politics. Like the philosophers of the Age of Enlightenment, we aim to connect every field of human endeavor and arrive at new insights to achieve longer lives, greater rationality, and the progress of our civilization. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our U.S. Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon of August 13th, 2023. My name is Gennady Stolyarov II. I am the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party, and today we are joined by an illustrious panel of U.S. Transhumanist Party officers, members, and advisors, including our Director of Visual Art, Art Ramon Garcia, our Director of Longevity Outreach, Ben Ballweg, our current Vice Chairman and Legislative Director, Jason Geringer, our Director of Community Science, Citizen and Community Science, a newly appointed officer, Daniel Tweed, who is also our 2024 U.S. Vice Presidential candidate, our technology advisor and foreign ambassador in Spain, Dr. Jose Cordero. And also a special guest joining us today is Mike P. Sin of CureDAO. We had an excellent virtual enlightenment salon on CureDAO last year. So welcome to all. Today, our topic of conversation will be the creation of longevity states and a new initiative called Vitalism. We're going to have Adam Gries from Vitalism.io joining us as a guest, hopefully in a little bit. He is trying to connect right now. And while he joins, we are going to explore a bit what Vitalism is. So Vitalism is a new concept, actually. It has the same name as an old concept. That old concept was a 19th century view that said only life may come from life. And this was a discredited concept because essentially in the 20th century, there were scientific discoveries that showed the possibility of, for instance, amino acids emerging from more basic components which were themselves inanimate. So it's not the case that life necessarily always requires previous life in order to originate. But vitalism, as Adam is going to explain it, is a very different concept and one that is very much aligned with our pursuit of longevity, radical life extension, curing aging, defeating death, however we might wish to characterize it. So we do have Adam here as our guest, and he is a four-time founder, angel investor, and longevity advocate. He has built products reaching over 80 million users. He holds a Bachelor's of Science degree in neuroscience. And Adam, welcome. Please tell us a bit about yourself, tell us a bit about Vitalism, and what you hope to accomplish with this initiative.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Gennady. Nice to meet. Thank you for everybody who's here. So very briefly about myself. So I was born and raised in Israel. I lived in the US as a child for a few years, hence my English. And I came back to the US for school. I studied neuroscience, economics, and psychology for undergrad. And since graduating in 2006, I've been a tech entrepreneur for about 16 years. It's been, and built and sold a variety of companies, some more successful, some less, all in consumer technology. So building apps, games, social platforms, and reaching quite a large number of users with an expertise in growth, social dynamics, and also became a self-taught software engineer in that process and reasonably strong. I've been doing some angel investing, and I've always had an interest in longevity, and what I mean by that is extending lifespan in ideal health indefinitely, and an interest in the nature of reality and in the nature of self. So I'm quite an experienced meditator. I've done 6 Vipassana 10-day retreats, and I did a lot of reading growing up about psychology and kind of the nature of the self and neuroscience, which is what also drove my academic interests later. I became aware of longevity as a scientific vector through Aubrey de Grey. I saw one of his talks probably in the mid-aughts, maybe 2005 or so, and immediately thought, yes, this is clearly the direction we should be moving in. We shouldn't just accept aging and death. We should fight as hard as possible. And the way I like to describe it is that I was basically hibernating for about 15 years after that. So even though I was aware of SENS, I even visited it, I knew the VP research who I'd met at a wedding, and I was supportive, I thought I couldn't really do much. I didn't have a PhD in biology, I wasn't very wealthy, and so I thought I should just climb Maslow's hierarchy. And that's what I was doing, building products in tech for all that period, until a little after COVID started. So when COVID started, I identified what was going to happen rather early. And I made some predictions then that panned out as I thought. And that put me in this position where I was revisiting parts of my life. I made a fair bit of money on the stock market due to these predictions, and I was considering what I should do next. And I was also in my late 30s, and so I revisited the situation of longevity and was surprised to find that there had been nothing released to increase maximum lifespan at all, and that the progress that had been made was very limited indeed, and that therefore I could expect there not to be sufficient progress in the next 20, 30 years, and that as a result of that, I was on the fast track to aging, decrepitude, and death, as all generations have been before. And so in the past 2 years, I've been on this journey to try to figure out what to do about that. And Vitalism is the answer that I came to for that question. So very briefly, just to close out this introduction, my initial steps were I started doing some angel investing. I found some biotechs like Loyal, the company extending dog lifespans, and ImmuneAge, and a few others, both in consumer tech and hard biotech. Started to educate myself, joined Foresight Institute as a mentor, trying to help companies fundraise and move the ecosystem of longevity forward. And at the same time, I was just doing my own research, trying to figure out what could change the game and kind of how far we were from what might be necessary. And my conclusion was that we are nowhere near, meaning that if current processes continue, we're basically all as good as dead. So I came to the conclusion that all of the optimistic statements about, the first person to live to 200 has been born, etc., were just unconvincing to me. And at the same time, it became clear that even though longevity had become more mainstream by maybe 1 or 2 orders of magnitude since 2005, it was still very, very tiny in terms of acceptance, and in terms of funding, it was just as tiny. And so when I saw that, I was just trying to think, well, okay, how can we change the game? How can humanity really fight hard against aging and against death? Primarily, of course, against death, but aging as the leading cause of death. And initially I thought, well, maybe we should convince the billionaires to do something about this. And I realized quickly that most billionaires just don't care about this, as evidenced by the fact that of all the billionaires, thousands of billionaires in the world, less than 1% has dedicated anything to fight longevity, fight aging or death through science. And so that eventually led my co-founder Nathan Chang and I to come up with the idea for Vitalism. And so I'll explain briefly what Vitalism is. We are the revolutionary movement against aging and death, and fundamentally the movement is philosophical in the sense that we have a few axioms. One, humanity should fight as hard as possible against aging and death. Two, we want to be conservative, meaning we're not trying to modify our biology more than necessary. So in other words, it is not equivalent to be uploaded to the cloud and to continue existing as a biological entity. Our goal is very clearly to stay close as close as we can, so modify very conservatively the biology to extend our lives from the perspective that life is a miracle and should be cherished, as close to what humanity is today. And then, if there is any evolution of that in the future, that can happen, but it should happen carefully and thoughtfully. And in context of that, Vitalism also has a perspective of the world today and what we might do to achieve this. So the perspective is that governments are, and basically higher level human organization, like jurisdictional organization, is a key component of allocating massive resources. And we like to use two examples. One, World War II, where the US spent about 40% of GDP on the war effort. So that's kind of a comparable of what it should mean to us to save ourselves from a premature death and from decrepitude. And then the Apollo project, which of course was not exactly part of the war. It was carried out during a completely capitalist economic period, and some thought it a vanity project, and yet the US spent as much as 0.4% of GDP on the effort. And so the idea is that through achieving influence at the jurisdictional level and through creating an ecosystem of for-profit and non-profit organizations that want to promote the Vitalist set of values, we could eventually get humanity to fight really hard against aging and death. And I think that might be a good opener. Thank you for listening.
Yes, thank you very much, Adam, for that introduction. And by the way, for anyone who is interested in finding out more about vitalism, please read the Vitalism white paper on vitalism.io, which explains in more detail the motivations for this movement as well as what it hopes to achieve. Now, I would ask you to discuss two matters that I think will be of interest to our viewers. First of all, how did you arrive at the name Vitalism? And second, could you tell us about the project to create and foster longevity states throughout the world? And I think we lost Adam, so that is unfortunate, but we will hopefully get him back. In the meantime, I do want to say that reading the Vitalism white paper was quite encouraging for me because it illustrated the intention to dramatically scale up the advocacy and the political action that will be needed in order to make the defeat of aging and death feasible within our lifetimes. I think it is indeed the case that progress is not as fast as it could be and should be, and we should welcome any movements that arise to alter that situation. But Adam, it seems that we have you back. So the questions that I had would focus on how you came up with the term vitalism for this movement, and also asking you to describe the effort to form longevity states. And let's see if...
Yeah, so regarding vitalism, the name. Yep.
Yes, please go on.
Am I back? I'm having some connection.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Pardon me. Can you please signal fresh?
Yeah, we can see you now.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I was saying the name vitalism basically came from a process of evaluation where we were looking at a variety of names that may be appropriate, and something that would be easy to spell. We thought that an ism was appropriate because we were talking about a philosophy / movement, and we also wanted something that had a connotation which had to do with life and vitality. And so Vitalism hit all those marks really well, as well as having some domain available where we had the vitalism.io domain available. Now, of course, Vitalism does have the historical context that Gennady mentioned, and to evaluate whether that was substantial, we viewed dozens of biology PhDs and some lay people, and our research showed that the vast majority of people, even biology PhDs, were simply not aware or did not remember this old movement. And so we believe that both in terms of visibility, like search engine rankings, and in terms of public perception, it would be possible to override that historical name, or at least take more space than that historical name in any way that would be consequential for the movement. And I'll just add very briefly that you might ask, well, why is a new name necessary at all? So in other words, you could use some existing name, longevity or anti-aging, or some other name. And I want to speak to that because I think it's a really important topic, specifically the issue of what I call namespace. Today, almost every namespace that has to do with extending lifespans and maximum health is, I would say, diffuse and corruptible or highly interpretable. And what I mean by that is that, let's say, the expression anti-aging, which is a generic English expression, can be used to mean everything from a cosmetic from South Korea, which may or may not work, to some longevity concierge service in a clinic somewhere in Texas or New York or where have you, to a company which is developing either supplements or possibly developing hardcore biotech to address aging. So in the same way, you could look at longevity today. I mean, when people ask me, or used to ask me, like, hey, what are you working on? And I'd say longevity. They'd immediately say, oh, well, yeah, I do a cold plunge. What's your supplement stack? And obviously that's exactly something that we don't mean, although I have nothing against those things. I like the sauna and a cold plunge as much as anybody. And I think that working on healthspan and applying the means that we have today using fitness and other interventions is to be lauded and is a good thing. I also think that has nothing to do with our goal, and I think many listeners' goal of achieving indefinite lifespans in perfect health, which will require substantial biological breakthroughs and other scientific breakthroughs, which we have no evidence at all that we're on track for. And so that's why we thought, Nathan and I, that a new namespace that could be very clearly defined and also defended, meaning bounded such that not every organization or company could represent itself in that way because it's a new word or a word that's not being used, would be very helpful. Whereas today, any person, any organization can say, well, we work on longevity, and there's really no entity that can enforce a standard or confirm that something means something. This is also very important from another perspective, which is the rallying perspective. If you think about we, the community who cares about extending lifespans indefinitely, who realizes that death is the problem and that aging is its primary driver, then today it's actually very hard to rally and to organize. So in other words, you go to a conference about longevity, you may find that actually, 50% of the people you talk to, when asked, oh, how long do you want to live, say something like 100 or 120, or when asked, what do you think about death? They'll say something like, well, death is fine. Or, maybe they believe in an afterlife or some other thing like that. And so that's why having a new namespace and why Vitalism as the choice came about. Happy to stop there or move on to talking about how state power and how we may be able to express things at the jurisdictional level both came about and may be operationalizable.
Yes, so let's move into the conversation about longevity states as well, because I think covering that would complete the introduction and then create the context for subsequent questions.
Yeah, fantastic. So fundamentally, if you think about major movements in history, major resource reallocation, that's kind of the first principles starting point that we came to this problem with. So we thought, look, let's not try to reinvent the wheel. How has humanity allocated resources differently? When did such things happen? And what we identified was a few examples of times. Most of these had to do with major philosophical changes, often having a religious component. So for example, the rise of Christianity, the rise of Islam, and then separately, in terms of political transformation, the rise of communism, the rise of the liberal republic with the American Revolution and the French Revolutions, and then respectively with Mormonism and Zionism, which were two persecuted groups, Mormons and Jews, that ended up consolidating their membership in a territory to try to achieve a level of jurisdictional autonomy and leveraged influence. And both, I would say, with a large degree of success. And so when you look at those movements, you can tell that historically, major reallocations happen according to this kind of pattern. And the pattern is you have a small group of highly motivated, hardcore people. This is true of the American Revolution, the French Revolution. It's as true of the Bolshevik and the Communist Revolution, with all the negatives that came from that, of course. And it's true of Mormonism, Zionism, and other religious movements, including Christianity. So this hardcore group, generally speaking, is very consolidated. It's initially, to some degree, I would say, ideologically homogenous, meaning people share the same ideas and have very high levels of trust. It's almost, in a way, like a startup. You know, a startup, an early startup, often benefits from very similar sets of values. And that hardcore group ends up finding beachheads to achieve leverage. And then by finding the right beachheads, can achieve major influence and then bring along the rest of the population and carry out a major reallocation of resources. So being students of history, we looked at that and we thought, okay, this is a pattern that works. We, without any condemnation or not in any pejorative sense, things like seasteading or new countries that don't really have some of the features of what we think about as nation states in terms of territory defense and other functions are simply, I would say, much more experimental and unproven. Whereas these patterns are simply proven. They're tried and true. Why reinvent the wheel when we know how things can work and do work? You get influence in a jurisdiction in a certain way. When you get that influence, you can reshape the resource allocation. And by reshaping that resource allocation, you can lead to vastly different results in terms of well-being and overall outcomes. And so then the question becomes, well, how can you carry out that process in the context that we're talking about? And so I'll speak to that on a few brief vectors. Number one, it's important to realize that the vast majority of people are not aware of this message, and many people may not resonate with certain parts of it simply because it's very far from them, and for many other reasons. It may, to some degree, create some tension or perceived tension. I don't think there needs to be tension with some religious conviction or other conviction. And so we're really talking about, in Vitalism, engaging initially probably a minority. It's not a small minority. I mean, there are a lot of people who they want to live as long as possible. They believe in science as the way to do that. They are motivated to support such efforts, and they realize that the current system and the way jurisdictions often handle population health are, let's say, limited and should be substantially changed, but they may not be as awake to the options that we're discussing. And so part of this is about outreach and engaging that population. I'll just put some numbers on that to make it clear how we think about this. Our estimate is that there are about 500,000 to 1 million people in the world out of 8 billion who believe intuitively that death is the problem and that aging is the primary thing that humans should work to solve. I think that there's probably a factor of between 10 and 100x that, which could be, let's say, engaged in some way. These are represented probably heavily in the kind of people who may listen to Andrew Huberman or Tim Ferriss or Peter Attia, even Tony Robbins, and other populations. And in fact, what we found is that it's actually pretty unpredictable in terms of socioeconomic context and, for example, age or other demographic factors, whether somebody would be minded towards living indefinitely or not, or living as long as possible or not. And so we estimate that we're talking about maybe 1% of the world's population, maybe max 3% of the world's population. Now, let's put that into numbers that matter to us in terms of, for example, a country or a state and how that unfolds on a jurisdictional level. So let's think about the US or Switzerland, which has cantons. The US, of course, has states, so it's highly federalized and has very high delegated autonomy to the different regions. And I'll just mention on this topic that when you think about change, there is, of course, the resource reallocation in terms of capital and manpower, et cetera. But there are also other features like a regulatory platform that allows innovation to happen effectively and quickly. There is the normalization, which can encourage people and support them from a cultural and social perspective to work on a field and make that a justified thing you can tell your parents, your grandparents about. And there are some other factors that have to do with regulations and management on other levels that are structural. There's also the education system. And so all these things do matter. And in a place like Switzerland and the US, they can be handled actually on a state level. So that's, and these two countries, of course, are democracies. So I'd like to kind of give 4 examples of how different jurisdictions could move towards becoming longevity states and what that means. And when I say longevity states, I mean jurisdiction that prioritizes fighting aging and death as a principal priority. And I also mean, and vitalism means, jurisdiction that really cares about optimizing human health. So that also, for example, could mean having better regulations and other aspects of governance that protect or defend or optimize human health. But of course, this expresses itself differently in different jurisdictions, and that's what I'll speak to next. I'll just give these 4 examples very briefly, and then we can go to any other topics that you'd like to discuss. So in a federal place like the United States or in Switzerland, you may look at a small segment of that federal space. So for example, there's the Free State Project, which is a libertarian movement that was trying to achieve substantial influence in one US state. They focused on New Hampshire, which is also the state that they were solicited by the governor. It was the only state of the, I think, 5 or 10 that they evaluated. And today, 18 years after people started moving to New Hampshire, when this initiative was very early on, they have 26 out of 400 representatives in the New Hampshire Assembly. So, you know, people sometimes say it's been a failure, but I would say that with only maybe 9,000, 10,000 people moved, I'm not sure the number, but that order of magnitude who moved to New Hampshire, a state of 1.1 million people, and of course having local people also support this movement, having 26 out of 400 representatives is punching substantially above their weight from a population perspective. And so that's an example. And of course, you could look at any other state in the US. The states have 2 senators each, so they have some influence on the federal level due to historical reasons, and states also have high autonomies, both in taxation, education, and to some degree regulation as well. And so having influence in a small US state seems a very attractive or a potentially attractive beachhead for a movement like ours. But of course, it doesn't have to be one US state, although I'll speak to that in a moment. It could also be a district where in the US to be elected as representative in a district, you need about 150, 200,000 votes usually. And we believe that if you had 5 to 10,000 votes in a given district that are unified as a block, you could have very substantial influence on the positions of the elected representatives. But of course, if you elect representatives, you're trying to create influence at the federal level, and that means horse trading, which is much more complicated, right? Because you have to convince other people in Congress, and then after Congress, you have to get a bill passed by the president who may or may not agree with the strategy, et cetera, et cetera. Much easier to have certain influence at the state level. But of course, the federal level is also important, for example, for NIH funding, NIH being the biggest biomedical research funder in the world by far. And so you want to look at all these levels. Now, at the state level in the US, I'll just use one example. So let's take a state like Rhode Island. Rhode Island, 1.1 million people or so population. The governor of Rhode Island elected with 200 and something thousand votes, if I'm not mistaken. But often in some of these states, this race is highly partisan. And so what matters is the primaries. In Rhode Island, the governor was elected in the Democratic primaries with about 60,000 votes. So you kind of see that the numbers become very, let's say, tractable or reasonable when you boil it down. When you're looking at a population in the US of 335 million, you're not talking about convincing millions of people. You're not talking about hundreds of thousands of people. And so if you could have some sort of influence on the identity of, for example, a governor, you could actually make quite a big difference in a given state. And the way we think about this in a place like a state in the US or a canton in Switzerland or other federal structures is that a state, if you have the right leadership, which believes in longevity being the medicine of the 21st century and believes in prevention and other aspects, not all of which have to do with immediately extending maximum lifespan, you could create what we call a positive cycle of greed. And what we mean by that is that if a state has aging biology departments, if a state has a thriving longevity biotech sector, which is attracting investment and high quality human capital, then other stakeholders in the state are going to hop on that wagon for interests that are much more secular, meaning it's driving jobs to their state. It's creating potentially meaningful economic upsides for them and their constituents, et cetera. And so that's on the federal level in the US and on the state level in the US, and I think comparable in a federal place like Switzerland, where just for context, the smallest canton, Switzerland, has a population of 16,000. So you can do the math yourself, what that suggests in terms of how much influence you need in terms of voting blocks to make a difference. Now, the thing is, in the US, for example, or in a country in Europe, like let's say a country in the EU, like Germany or France or any other country, even a small country, even if you have some influence, which can define where research dollars go, subsidies for longevity biotech and other things that could change the game in terms of resource reallocation. And even if you impact education, there's one thing it's very hard to impact, which is regulatory structures. That's at the FDA level in the US, at the EMA level in the EU, and those govern basically global regulation. And we saw during COVID how much there is a process of, from a negative perspective, groupthink, and from a positive perspective, let's call it global standards, when you deal with biomedical innovation. And so when you think about progressive regulation, there are certain things that you need to push on outside these countries. For example, in special economic zones like Prosper and Honduras, there's a special economic zone that's being developed in the UAE and elsewhere. So those jurisdictions could also become longevity states, but they would be focused on primarily progressive regulation and not resource reallocation for R&D and other benefits. And then finally, you could look at a small country. Smaller countries like Montenegro have a particular advantage. Outside of regulatory control, they also control their immigration. And this is quite important because if you think about certain countries like India or China, Indonesia, and otherwise, even if you have a lot of Vitalists in those countries and they want to make a big difference, they can't get into the US. They probably can't get into Switzerland or Europe, but they may be able to be invited to a smaller country which sees an opportunity to be a first mover in the medicine of the 21st century, namely in longevity medicine, or what we call, Vitalist associated efforts. And so those are some key ways that a small critical mass of people can, we believe, have a very dramatically outsized impact. I hope that was helpful.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much, Adam, for that overview. I think it illustrates quite well what the project of fostering longevity states is about and the considerations that you engaged in. I think it is quite a promising framework with which to view many different types of jurisdictions and their relative advantages in promoting longevity research, radical longevity research for curing aging and defeating death, which we definitely need more of. I would like to highlight a few of our viewer comments, and then we will get into the question and answer period of our salon. So first of all, Twin Soul Tarot expressed a sentiment that I think we will all agree with. Death causes an immeasurable amount of emotional suffering for those living, needless to say. And yes, when we think about all of the people whom we have lost, it is just a tragedy, an immense number of irreplaceable individual universes that have just disappeared and cannot be fully replicated or restored. Our friend Jason Mercurio from Ageless Partners believes that you made good points, and of course, we value Jason's opinion quite highly. And Daniel writes that death is the condition that destroys all other individual human rights, and the human rights activist community ought to strenuously acknowledge that. Yes, you cannot have any other rights without the right to life and without the state of being alive. I think a lot of people miss that, and it bears some emphasis. So the first question that I would like to pose comes from our friend Luis Arroyo, and he wonders, so the notion of a longevity state is simply to focus on a state or district or a special economic zone or a smaller country in which political power is used to allocate resources to longevity efforts. So that's kind of how he interprets it. I think there are more dimensions to this, but Adam, I will let you take that question.
I appreciate it. Yeah, and thank you for the question. I would say that the primary concept is useful to think about at the highest level, meaning a longevity state is a jurisdiction which prioritizes fighting aging and death as a primary priority. And so in other words, it's a very philosophical perspective about what we believe human organization should do, because governments are ultimately just organizations of humans that are trying to secure a population's well-being, and what we think the correct values are in evaluating resource allocation for such groups. And so I know that's quite abstract, but I think it's very important because ultimately, when you think of countries or states, there's the focus on the state or district, and that's a strategy around longevity states. But what's important here is getting more jurisdictions to become longevity states, to have those values in mind as primary values until eventually, and this is our goal as soon as possible, for all states to be longevity states, because really all states should secure that fundamental right to life that we believe is a human right. So largely, I agree with.
It looks like we lost Adam's signal, but it seems that he did largely agree with the premise of the question, but he elaborated upon it a bit more. And while we try to get him back, I want to highlight a few of our other viewer comments. David Shoemaker, our Director of Applied Innovation, writes that states or districts that have biotech companies might be ripe for development with Adam's ideas. And indeed, if there are already existing institutions, businesses, research facilities, academic facilities that focus on longevity and medicine in some ways, those could help in building up the critical mass for a longevity state. Now, Mike Lazine wonders what US states are the most transhumanist friendly. And this is an interesting question because actually the US Transhumanist Party membership is quite spread out throughout the United States. And furthermore, the institutional environments certainly vary by state. So while we can say, well, a lot of startups are based in California, for instance, California doesn't necessarily have the friendliest regulatory regime toward cutting edge research. Indeed, if you want to engage in cutting edge research, sometimes going outside the United States may be prudent, as Liz Parrish did, for instance, when she became patient zero for the first combination gene therapy aimed at reversing biological aging back in 2015. But there are some jurisdictions which have less burdensome regulatory requirements compared to California. But there may be a situation in those jurisdictions where there's not yet a critical mass of the population that espouse transhumanist ideas. And so the advocacy work, the persuasion work may need to be done to a greater extent in those areas. It looks like we have Adam coming back. Hello again, Adam.
Yeah, really sorry for the technical issues today. Thank you.
Yes, so you were finishing up the answer to Luisa's question about longevity states, and I was going to let you conclude your thoughts before moving on to the next question.
Yeah, thank you. I was just saying that really, I think he encapsulated the goal operatively, but really the stress I was going to give that is a higher level of abstraction is the goal, meaning that we want every state to simply prioritize this as its highest priority. And that is divorced from the specific strategy of trying to achieve influence through this or that state, etc. So, and by the way, that is also subservient to the higher goal, which is simply for humanity to fight as hard as possible, which today lends itself to the strategy of longevity states, we believe, but in the future may not.
Yes, thank you for that, Adam. And Jason Geringer has some feedback. He says that he likes this notion. It is like a strategic plan to leverage our collective voting power into a block and concentrate that in an area where it will be effective. And I think the example of the Free State Project in New Hampshire that you used is a fitting analogy for what could be done with a longevity state with enough resources, enough advocacy, enough interested individuals and organizations, perhaps relocating to that jurisdiction if they see it as having that much promise. Now, I would like to pose a question that was raised by Mike Sin. He wonders, what do you feel the ideal system of governance would be for a longevity state? Would it be representative democracy, direct democracy, something else? I mean, the UAE is a kind of interesting, I would say, decentralized monarchy in the sense that they have different sheikhs who are in charge of like particular jurisdictions. There's the Emirate of Dubai, for instance, where the governance is pretty autonomous. So what do you think is the best, if there is one, system of governance for a longevity state?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I would say that Vitalism doesn't really take a position on that. And I don't have I mean, I have my own preferences, of course, in terms of governance. And I do have a perspective around, what seems to be good for human flourishing. That being said, I believe that any state can move towards being a longevity state. And in fact, certain states have advantages in different ways. So I'll give an example. In Saudi Arabia, for example, which is, in many ways a very conservative country, it's controlled very centrally and is not a liberal democracy in the sense that it's a monarchy. It's controlled by a strong leader. That country has allocated $1 billion a year, up to $1 billion a year through evolution, to work on longevity. Now, it could be argued whether that $1 billion will all be used and what exactly is meant by longevity in their mind, et cetera, et cetera. But that is actually the single largest commitment of any jurisdiction anywhere in the world to longevity, and represents 0.125% of the Saudi GDP, which is $800 billion a year approximately. And so if we think about the target of Vitalism, the initial target being to have 1% of global GDP, meaning $1 trillion a year, dedicated to fight aging and therefore death, Saudi is actually the closest to a longevity state of any states, which it sounds maybe very surprising or ironic. I think that countries like that can make certain types of progress in this way, which is very top-down heavy, et cetera. I'll give another example, a jurisdiction in the US, Montana, which is a Republican jurisdiction, where Republicans control, if I'm not mistaken, more than 2/3 of the House, the Senate, the state Senate and House, meaning, and the governorship, which recently, about a month and a half ago, passed a law for right to try, where they allow any physician in the state to prescribe any intervention which passed phase 1 trials to any patient, to any person. This is a unique innovation in the sense that before that, you had to be terminally ill. So you had to be verifiably terminally ill to get that kind of prescription. And the interesting thing here is that this passed in a Republican state. And it's in the context of the desire to do right to try and my body, my choice, and more libertarian or kind of conservative in the US sense perspectives. Whereas a state like Montana would never double the allocation of capital to, let's say, R&D through raising taxes. Whereas a democratic state in the US might do that, or a social democratic state country in Europe, like Sweden or others, might do resource allocation like that. And so in other words, I think that any system of governance could be effective to promote the longevity movement and the vitalist movement, and they'll be effective in different dimensions. And so there might be some systems that, let's say, can carry a larger weight, but I don't have a strong perspective on that. I think it's too early to say.
Yes, thank you for that answer, Adam. And indeed, different jurisdictions may have different advantages and disadvantages in terms of what they can do to contribute to the overall picture and the many components of the solution for rendering the pursuit of radical longevity a priority. Speaking of the Montana Right to Try Act, the achievement of that legislation was driven in large part by A4LI, the Alliance for Longevity Initiatives. And here I have posted a link to their press release on it. This happened in May of 2023, so fairly recently. And actually, in June, I had the opportunity to speak briefly with Dylan Livingston, who is the founder of A4LI, and he told me a little bit of the backstory behind how he was able to achieve this. But one of the insights that he communicated is it's actually advantageous to some extent to have politicians who don't have a lot of prior ideological or emotional investment in this area, but who could see it as an easy win and a kind of
Yes.
nonpartisan win, because they don't see it as a wedge issue. They don't see it as something that would divide their constituents. So if they're Republican legislators or a Republican governor, or if they're Democratic legislators or a Democratic governor, they could still see this as an issue where they can cross party lines, they can get support from their colleagues and pass it essentially to their credit. So I wonder if you think that's a viable strategy to kind of approach politicians of either major party or minor parties and say, look, this is not a partisan issue. This is something that we should all be interested in. And you can achieve an easy win by passing something like that, like an extended right to try act, essentially.
Yeah. Yeah, so I totally agree with that. I would consider A4LI a Vitalist organization. I know, Dylan, we haven't spoken about that yet because Vitalism is just kind of coming into the public eye and really going live very recently. But I think the work they're doing is great. And I do agree with this idea of leveraging the newness of certain concepts which don't have as much of a prior backlog of commitments or partisan relationships. Now, that being said, I will say that political intervention can come into effect in different ways in different places, and you have to be very thoughtful and dynamic in how you approach it. So to give one example, in a place that's libertarian or Republican, if you wanted people to eat healthier, you would certainly not be able to do that in a what some people would consider a nanny state way. So in other words, they would look very disfavorably upon regulation that raises taxes on processed foods or sugar or stuff like that. But one way you may be able to get around that is you might say, well, you know what? Hey, our state produces vegetables. Why don't we create a major marketing campaign with taxpayer dollars for vegetables grown in, Oregon or Montana or wherever, or even to some degree make it easier for state schools to order those goods with some sort of priority and thereby secure healthier food for the residents of this state. So different contexts, different cultures will require different approaches. And I think we need to be cognizant that we won't be able to make the same kind of breakthroughs in each jurisdiction. And so in other words, I totally agree with the sentiment and just would add the asterisk that it kind of depends on the context, which area of breakthrough may be achievable.
Yes, it definitely does depend, and those nuances are important to keep in mind as we approach advocacy in particular jurisdictions. Now let's go to Dr. Jose Cordero, who has a question.
Hello, Adam. It's good to see you again. And thank you so much also for writing one of the first book reviews of The Death of Death on Amazon. I am immortally grateful to you, at least literally, for writing that. Thank you. We were together a couple of months ago in Susalu in Montenegro. Well, you were some weeks, I was some other weeks, but there was a lot of excitement in Susalu, which is in Montenegro, that they could declare aging as a disease that could be cured. So my question is about that, because they said they were going to do it in 2 weeks, in 4 weeks, and I have seen nothing, and I don't think anything will happen. So I'm asking you if you are aware of what might happen there, and if there are other places interested in that proposal of declaring aging as a curable disease right now. That is question 1. And number 2, don't forget, you were also organizing an event, I think, in Rhode Island, where you were going to have many of these cities, states, or countries interested on declaring aging as a disease. What is the status of that conference?
Thank you. So yeah, I'll speak to that very briefly. And I appreciate the question. And by the way, love the work, Jose, you're doing and your new book. Highly recommended for anybody in the audience who hasn't checked it out. Yeah, so briefly, I'm not aware of the specific steps that Montenegro has taken, so I don't have any good or bad news on that topic. I will say on the topic of declaring aging a disease or not, that I think the question is mostly a red herring, and I'll explain why. The way I look at it, biomedical research and progress is trapped in this kind of vicious cycle. And the vicious cycle works like this. You have the major funders of biomedical research, in the US's case, the NIH, other countries have similar bodies. And those bodies have a mandate to spend money, which is defined by the legislatures of said countries, and the US, the Congress. Now, if you think about a congressperson, what are the motivators that are going to define how they're going to vote and how they're going to think about mandating? Well, very often it's going to impact what they think is going to drive them contributions or votes for the next election, or what will make them look good. And so there are two major sources of gravity that impact these lawmakers. There are other ones probably too, but here are two major ones. Number one, patient groups, and also the visibility of diseases. So, you know, my parent had heart disease, my friend had cancer, et cetera. People know about these things. And there are patient groups like Michael J. Spock's Foundation, Susan G. Komen Foundation. Nothing wrong with those foundations. They're doing a lot of good work. And they're trying to convince the politicians to mandate investment in research on disease, which is different than our perspective, right? Because we're saying aging is the core problem, not the diseases of aging. And we think that focusing on diseases is a problem in itself. And you'll see how this ties into the question shortly. Then there are, of course, the pharma dollars that lobby for lawmakers to allocate money to the kind of research that could be operationalized or productized as something which can get through FDA approval and can then potentially be taken by pharma and become a blockbuster that supports their revenue model. Also, nothing is malicious or hidden about this. This is just kind of how these organizations are built to think, and those are their incentives. So what's the result of that? Lawmakers mandate money to go into diseases. The NIH allocates that money towards disease research. You know, the way I like to think about it is wherever you're going, that's where you're going to get. So if you're trying to solve Alzheimer's or heart disease or cancer, well, guess what? You're not going to solve aging because you're not focused on aging, right? And then those research efforts produce some translational work. That translational work may create some organization, biotech, et cetera, go through phase trials, which of course are all disease oriented. And then the pharma are happy to take those interventions when they treat disease and then deploy them. So how does this relate to declaring aging as a disease being a red herring? If you look at the FDA is basically trying, it came from a history of risk reduction. So originally you had all these in the turn of the century from the 19th to the 20th, you had all these players who were just like selling all sorts of scams, snake oil, et cetera, and getting people sick or taking advantage of them financially. And so it was clear that some regulation was necessary. And so the FDA's perspective was really protecting the public and is really oriented towards risk mitigation and not prevention. Now, that's not true across the board. For example, statins, which are preventative, have been approved through a biomarker, which is a correlate, the LDL cholesterol as a biomarker. And so when you look at the FDA has multiple issues. One issue is that, okay, let's say you declare aging a disease, or let's just say you have a product that can help people and you want to get it through FDA approval. Well, you have a few issues. Number one, can it even make it to a phase 1 trial? There, maybe by declaring aging a disease, you could get to the phase 1 trial. But ultimately, you're going to have to evaluate whether you are impacting some variable which is meaningful in the context of the issue in question, meaning this disease, this so-called disease of aging. And when you look at the FDA, from what I've seen and heard, they're actually quite open in using functional measures, for example, to evaluate the efficacy of certain treatments. And one of the issues is that the interventions that exist so far are simply incremental. They don't have the functional impact that would actually justify the FDA approving them. And the second aspect of this is because the FDA is a risk mitigating oriented organization, even if you declare aging a disease, with the FDA, there's this joke where they say that if they tried to pass water through the FDA, it wouldn't pass because it could harm somebody. And by the same token, I think that, what we really need is a rethinking of what is prevention, how we create benefit, what are the key biomarkers, and that's where the efforts need to go, because even if kind of on the face of it, aging were declared a disease, the operative consequence of that, I don't think would be much different than what we have today, not to speak of the whole process where, you need $100 million or more to get a new intervention through trials into the public. And so it's just a multifactorial issue. And yes, declaring aging a disease, from my perspective, would be potentially a positive, but I think it would only create limited value. And I'll just add one thing to that, which is that I think we need to be very careful with our language. Calling aging in a society where there is rampant ageism and where people who are aged, especially retired or elderly beyond a certain chronological age, are very substantially disenfranchised, using the moniker disease to describe aging could lead to negative social consequences and perceptions and labeling. And so I do think we need to be very careful of that. And that is also one of the reasons that I understand why people resist this naming. And I am more biased towards the notion that aging is a treatable condition rather than a disease. Besides that, the whole question of what is a disease, ultimately, we look at a state which is some sort of pathological state, and then there's a certain point in its evolution where we say, oh, now it's labeled a disease, right? So in other words, you have to lose a certain number of neurons in your substantia nigra for people to say you have Parkinson's or whatever case it is, right? There's a biological decline, then there's functional decline, then at some point we arbitrarily call something a disease. I think those definitions are really problematic in the first place. And so I worry that that's not going to be a very helpful place to focus on for those reasons. And then speaking to the question of the conference, yeah, I'm really excited to share that we're hosting the Longevity State Congress. You can check out more about it at longevitystate.com, and you can apply to attend. It's going to be a very small Congress, and the idea there is to bring together people who are of a revolutionary mindset and are eager to participate to make this longevity state revolution a reality as soon as possible. It's going to have some presentations and a lot of workshops. It's going to be held in Providence, Rhode Island, obviously in the context of being one small and interesting jurisdiction, but in general being somewhere interesting and also close to Boston on the Eastern Seaboard. That's the answer.
Yes. Thank you very much, Adam, for those responses. And again, those who are interested in the Longevity State Congress in 2023, please go to longevitystate.com and check it out. Now, a bit of feedback on your responses in terms of aging being classified as a disease. I myself am a supporter of the idea because I think it could bring more momentum to our movement. Any such declaration would attract focus to the fight against aging and would invite discussions, and the jurisdictions that adopt such declarations could be seen as being at the forefront of medical innovation, and other jurisdictions may then wish to emulate them. But I understand there are different perspectives. So for instance, Dr. Aubrey de Grey would use the term that you used, which is aging is a treatable medical condition, because it is. And he believes that by using that wording, it kind of bypasses the perhaps semantic discussion about what is a disease. Now, I must say it does surprise me that a lot of people in the general public, when they hear aging is a disease, they might misinterpret it as some sort of condemnation of
Mhm,
the elderly because,
mhm, mhm,
well, if you have a broken foot, for instance, or if you have some sort of genetic disease, like, say, Huntington's disease, nobody is going to say you are a bad person because you have those kinds of conditions. So I wonder where it comes from that people think, well, if you say aging is a disease, you're somehow saying elderly people are bad people or they're somehow less than
mhm.
the rest of us, which is not what we're saying at all. We're saying we want to help them. We want to cure them of this condition so that they could lead better lives and they're around for longer. We value them. That's why we don't want them to succumb to this condition. So, where do you think this misunderstanding comes from and why is it so apparently persistent?
I mean, my perspective on this is that it all has to do with utility in society. So when you think about aged individuals, we have a perspective which is proven by the way we treat people after retirement, and where society treats them as less valuable. And that perspective is something that many people reject for understandable reasons. Now, in addition, if you think about our overall declines in function and other declines that have to do with chronological age, the fundamental kind of irony that is omnipresent is that most people try to either deny or avoid the results of aging. And that could be in the most superficial way by getting Botox or getting some other cosmetic procedure, or by confronting the fact of reduction in, for example, cognitive capacity, which happens with age, by different reasonings or structures, mental models, which suggest something like, oh, well, well, you may lose speed, but you gain wisdom or some other abstraction. And so in general, I feel like most people acknowledge and know deep down that chronological age beyond a certain point suggests declines in function. Declines in function imply directly lower utility for society, and lower utility implies lower status. And we're creatures of status. And so by adding the label disease, you're just aggravating something that people are trying to run away from, and I think creating a very triggering moment for them. So that's my perspective on it.
Yes, thank you. And this is very interesting, of course. I agree with the observation that the desire for status drives a lot of people's reactions to particular ideas. I think it might help to emphasize to people who perhaps fear being disrespected on account of their age that if biological aging were reversed, then all of the advantages of chronological aging, including the wisdom, would become that much more potent. Because imagine having the wisdom and experience of age, but combined with the vitality of youth and many, many years and decades to look forward to. That is an immensely powerful combination. And hopefully, people would then look forward to getting older. That's what I think true healthy aging would be. Now, I am also wondering about your thoughts regarding what the rate limiting factors are today to the achievement of longevity escape velocity in our lifetimes, because clearly you have expressed the view that progress right now is insufficiently fast, and I'm inclined to agree with that. But it seems to me, based on your comments, that you believe that progress is technically achievable within our lifetimes. So my understanding is the rate limiting factors are in terms of resource allocation and public support. But I'm wondering if there are any other rate limiting factors that exist today that you would like to emphasize.
Yeah, great question. I appreciate that. So I just say to open, I don't think there is a clear path to go. So I am not particularly optimistic that we can solve the problem, even if we fight as hard as possible. But I do think that we should fight as hard as possible. And I do think we are extremely far from fighting as hard as possible. And therefore, it's clear that we should change our approach and our level of intensity. And so I'll just say on that front, you look at some of the interventions that exist today, epigenetic reprogramming, the approach, the damage repair approach, and looking at the different areas of breakdown, and some of the problems. I mean, I think Aubrey has contributed a lot. I also appreciate some of the thoughts that people like Charles Brenner have shared, where, with the hallmarks, if there isn't something falsifiable and you actually have to solve multiple of them to see a substantial impact, you're really kind of lost in terms of showing any movement towards the goal. And we don't have that much time to wait. Also, working in animal models, especially mice, is very problematic, especially when a lot of these mice models are not even wild type mice. They're some sort of Franken mice. So I don't hold much stock in that. And this stuff is often obfuscated in the mainstream media. Study shows blah, 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 blah. And then you read the details and it's like, oh yeah, it was some Franken mouse, poor mouse. Or you put it in some very deranged state and then you manage to modify that deranged state. I mean, that tells me nothing about whether this could help me or my loved ones, et cetera. Really close to nothing. So, but to answer the question around what other sources of leverage there are, I think we're talking about capital, we're talking about regulations, we're talking about normalization through education and through different media that we can develop to get people over the hump to realize that this is a justified and a valuable thing to work on. So those are mainly the things. So in other words, adding to what you mentioned, regulation, education, media, and then of course, capital and political wherewithal.
Yes, thank you very much, Adam, for that assessment. And I do think we need to focus on better experimental design in many cases. This is where I'm very optimistic about the robust mouse rejuvenation study that's currently being undertaken by the Longevity Escape Velocity Foundation that is headed by Dr. Aubrey de Grey, because that study isn't looking to take mutant mice that have been engineered to have certain vulnerabilities or certain disease conditions and then try to make them better relative to those engineered conditions. This study is taking pretty much ordinary mice in middle age and essentially trying combinations of interventions. There are 4 different interventions. To some mice, they're being administered in isolation. To some, they're being administered in combination. And there are, of course, control groups for every experimental group. And the majority of these mice are going to be followed to their, I would say, quote, natural expiration after the administration of these treatments. So there's no arbitrary cutoff point to this study. So my hope is with the robust mouse rejuvenation study, a lot of these issues that you described quite validly will not be the case, and the public will see the effects of that superior experimental design. Now I would like to open this up to questions from the rest of our panel. Who would like to ask the next question? Jason.
I could say something. Yeah, you got a lot of really cool ideas. You're a really strategic thinker. I like that whole concept of strategically using your voting power as a block, as a community, and then concentrating that somewhere where it'd be effective. I think that's a brilliant idea. It makes me wonder, if there was to be some kind of, community somewhere. It strikes me that the nursing homes are kind of like bad in this country. It would be awesome, really, if that community was like a really good nursing home where we could then both have people's quality of life at the end of, and possibly help us, with both the voting block and the research, even just an idea. But also, that was the first good answer I've ever really heard for why possibly not to call aging a disease. The social stigma of that just never occurred to me. So I thought that was another really interesting idea. That's all. I meant earlier. I think you said you built games before. Well, the Transhuman Club, we want to build a game called LEV, but none of us are coders, So just throwing that out there. If you want to build a game, maybe we could do that. Just an idea. But toss it to the next person. I don't really have much question.
Well, I will. So thank you for that question. I'll just mention, or those ideas. I'll just mention that I do think that retirement homes and other assisted living situations are places where we could engage with people, and we should engage with people. One of the key ideas behind Vitalism, and it's in the Vitalist Declaration, which you can find at vitalism.io, is that one should do acts of charity for those most impacted by aging and death. And that includes, of course, those who are suffering from aging. And some of those people reside in these assisted living communities, et cetera. And so there's both the aspect of acts of charity. There's also the aspect of engagement with people who have everything to lose and so much to gain by being involved in this movement. And I'll just say one, maybe, I don't know if it was clear, but a very important thing, which is that when you think about extending lifespans and maximum health, there are many things that can be done today, which are, let's say, very palatable and kind of mainstream, which have nothing to do with fighting death or extending lifespans indefinitely, even though they are exactly overlapping with them. For example, today we spend about 30% or 40% of our healthcare capital on the last year or few years of life. And this is just bananas. It's not creating a better experience for those people dying, really, and it's definitely not creating good value for society. And so many people can agree that instead of spending that money there, we should think about prevention. And of course, the best type of prevention is preventing aging altogether. So there are kind of different layers that we can address that prevention, both with exercise and other more traditional preventative medicine, but also, of course, tying that to the notion of fighting aging. And I think there is very high responsiveness for the profligate spending that there is today. And that's actually quite a mainstream perspective.
Yes, thank you, Adam. And now let's go to Mike Sin.
Hi, how you doing? It's lovely to see you again. So I was wondering if there is any sort of initiative within the Vitalism movement to create kind of a global, decentralized adjunct or complement to the FDA that would collect data from people in these nursing homes, for instance, and all of the people on Reddit who are currently self-experimenting with a lot of other life extension interventions, and use this to determine the benefits and risks of lots of different interventions for specific populations at a very low cost relative to a controlled, like double-blind RCT. So yeah, is there anybody working on kind of like a global, also a benefit of this kind of global FDA would be reduction of duplication of effort. We have a lot of duplication in regulatory agencies internationally, so it could potentially address that. Have you guys thought about that?
Mm-hmm. So I have to say I've heard of this notion, but I don't know anybody who's working on it very directly, and I think it's a great idea. And so the way I would say this fits into the Vitalist community is that anybody founding such an organization, well, that organization could self-identify and then be designated officially as a Vitalist organization, and that would help it achieve its goal by providing a kind of rallying beacon for other Vitalists, both as sources of funding, potential employees, members, supporters, etc. If you or somebody you know wants to spin up that kind of initiative, please engage me, and I'd love to support.
Great. Can I ask one more question?
Sure.
So there's these robots, and so they have the ability to process data a lot faster than humans, potentially like over 100 times faster. And then, so if we had, they're also good at sharing knowledge. So a lot of research is never published. I think a majority of it. So there's tons of duplication of effort in terms of trials that they're not aware of. Whereas robots would be aware if we kind of replaced or created AI like Elon Musk is creating this Optimus humanoid robot. You put GPT, had them all networked, and they would have knowledge of all the other robots' activities, and they could work 24/7. They could have significantly greater precision and accuracy. Then you could potentially, I did some estimates using a 90% confidence interval, you could potentially increase the rate of scientific progress somewhere between 50 times to 1,000 times faster than it is currently. So if there's about 7 million scientists, so if you had 7 million robots, the robots are supposed to cost like $20,000 according to Elon Musk. So they would be about 5 times cheaper than a scientist per year. So it seems like this could potentially have more leverage, making sure that this is able to occur. Could potentially, like you could create, if you created 1,000 years of scientific progress in a single year, I think your problems would be solved. But it could be prevented by, I think, regulatory capture. If you invested in a biotech ETF, for instance, about 8 years ago, you'd have like about a 0% return on investment, versus if you invested in Boeing or something, you'd have a few 100% over the same time period, because of the regulatory issues that prevent any kind of progress in the biotechnology industry. So is there any element of like your Vitalism movement that is focused on enabling, like preventing this repeat of the FDA's kind of slowdown of innovation in terms of AI? Because I think it could repeat itself.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I would say that there isn't today specific treatment in the Vitalism content base of this problem or potential problem. And I would invite you, if you share these ideas, I would consider you a Vitalist, and you may self-identify as a Vitalist, to suggest such content or contribute such content. Ultimately, we know that the FDA is broken in certain ways from achieving the kind of acceleration that many people agree is good, even some people within the FDA. And by the same token, there are certain restrictions on other innovation that may similarly prohibit or limit acceleration. And so the more sophisticated we get about thinking of what structures are the ideal structures, I think the better off we would be in exerting our influence to approach those. So I support it, but I don't have a strong perspective on that. I think it sounds like a promising vector.
Thank you.
Yep.
Yes, thank you, Adam, and thank you, Mike, for those questions. Now let us go to Daniel Tweed.
Yeah, very important topic. I'm thinking that if we can't get states to embrace the idea of self-supporting optimal health span, maybe intentional communities would be a place to do that. And also, if we were to come up with some kind of factor that was be an integrated number for optimal health span, would that be something simple to compute, like maybe chronological age divided by biological age? And also, I want to point out the value of potential gamification. There's Oklahoma City had a mayor named Mick Cormet that challenged the whole. They were originally the most obese city in the country, and they lost 1 million pounds when the mayor challenged them. So thoughts on those kinds of gamifications and computing like an optimal health span factor?
Yeah, there were three, I would say, questions there, right? Optimal health span factor, gamification, and this idea of intentional communities.
Right, thanks.
And so I'll address the intentional communities first, and then the optimal health span, then gamification. So intentional communities, I think, are a great place that will be more open-minded to integrating different aspects of, let's say, preventative behavior, longevity, interventions that are more cutting edge, et cetera, that have suggestive influence. And those are great things. That being said, these intentional communities, unless they rally together and reach some critical mass and act as a lever to influence some centralized resource allocation, I think will have limited influence. And so I see them as a piece of the puzzle, but I don't think they can achieve that much independently. Secondly, health span, how do you measure health span? I think that broadly speaking, it's actually pretty simple. And the challenge is really about effect size. So there was that study, I think it was in Singapore, on alpha ketoglutarate. Maybe some of you have heard about it. And they were asserting that people reduced 8 years of their biological age. They used that phrase, biological age, which I think is, very problematic and misrepresentative. But anyway, or they would, or they sometimes use it interchangeably with epigenetic age, which of course is not, doesn't create the same perception in the listener. But anyway, what I always say about these studies is, you said you shaved 8 years on average from people's age. Show me the photos. Where are the photos? Because ultimately, like, you look at functional measures, VO2 max, walk a mile, show me the elasticity of your skin, show me how you look. An effect size of reducing somebody's age by 8 years, I promise you, is going to be visible to any human. I mean, unless it's happening in some sort of, like, you only did it in some organ, but nowhere else in your body, which, okay, there would be a question mark around the utility of that. And so I think where we end up is that it distills to interventions which have very limited effect size or express themselves over very extended time periods, and therefore are very hard to evaluate. And this is a legitimately tough problem. And so being in the FDA or in any other organization that's trying to evaluate efficacy of anything and judge it, I think is a complicated place to be. And so I guess, in other words, I want to say that the features of health, namely certain key biomarkers, the simple biomarkers that you get at, okay, maybe not in one medical test, but with Inside Tracker or a number of other health biometrics services, are absolutely sufficient when combined with functional measures to evaluate your status health span wise. It's that when we marry these to interventions, we don't really know how to understand smaller effect sizes, longer time horizons, and we don't really know how to evaluate the difference between an impact on aging and simply an impact on healthfulness and robustness. Namely, if you start exercising and you lose 20 pounds and you're more active, et cetera, did you become more youthful? I would say in many cases, absolutely not. You didn't. You just became healthier. So in other words, you've realized more of the health potential for your chronological age. And that might express itself, by the way, histologically, functionally, and in many other measures. So it becomes very tricky to understand whether you've impacted aging or not. And so I guess the bottom line from that is that we need to do a lot more work there to understand how we evaluate, measure, and carry out iteration on this stuff. And that's somewhere where we could spend probably billions and billions of dollars, and we should be spending that money. And then the third comment about gamification, I think it's really important to use these behavioral measures to influence people to do the right thing. This is true in behavioral economics, which is an area that I've studied and I'm very involved in, and also in other areas. Ultimately, people respond predictably to different stimulus, and we know that certain patterns like loss aversion drive stronger responses than reward, et cetera, et cetera. And so we as a community absolutely should leverage these insights and develop platforms and patterns that support positive outcomes for our community and the general public. So yeah, I totally resonate with that. And with regards to the game you mentioned, I'll definitely keep it on my radar to see if I can connect people who are relevant.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much, Adam. And our friend John H. writes that he really likes your devotion to evidence, and he also writes pictures or it didn't happen in terms of the reversal of biological age. And yes, I would be inclined to agree. I think a lot of people focus on biomarkers of aging, but my friend and our biotechnology advisor, Dr. Bill Andrews, like to point out that back when Betty White was alive, the real test of whether biological age reversal would succeed would be Betty White walking onto the stage and looking like she was 25 again. And then people would have no doubts that biological aging had been reversed. Now, David Shoemaker along these lines wonders, how do the various aging clocks help or hurt in measuring aging? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I have very mixed feelings about this stuff. So these aging clocks are really interesting research. I am generally biased to the perspective that, which is the, let's say, official, health regulatory perspective, that these tests should be evaluated as data for entertainment purposes only and not for diagnostic purposes. That's really, to a large degree, where they are, even though they do have some interesting measures and correlations and implications with morbidity and other data and certain predictive aspects. So in other words, I think they're really interesting science. And I think the messaging around them is very problematic. So I'll just mention a few things that I'd love to see different or changed. Number one, I don't think anybody should use the words biological age to describe these clocks. That is very misleading. It's simply false. They are not measuring biological age in any way that the average lay person perceives biological age, except in the narrow, but rather in the narrow academic sense of whatever it is that they are in fact measuring, some epigenetic thing or another, or et cetera. And so this is an extremely big problem for multiple reasons. Number one, the average lay person who hears this might get when they hear biological age, my perspective is that the immediate understanding, the common connotation is, oh, that means that everything in that biological body is now the equivalent or the average of what could be expected from that chronological age. This is absolutely false. This is not what these clocks measure at all. But I think that's a very intuitive lay understanding of what it might mean. So I would never use those terms, but people do use these terms because they convert in terms of their ads and other landing pages, et cetera. And they're sexy for the clickbaity articles. So I find that very unfortunate. Another downstream impact of this is that it sends the message to people that we know that humanity knows how to measure biological age. This is just false. So now you have these companies that are spending millions and millions, maybe tens or maybe hundreds of millions of dollars in aggregate to promote a message which is highly misleading. And now think about your average person who basically is subconsciously trying to avoid confrontation with aging and death, and will grasp at any straw which allows them to avoid that confrontation, whether it's religious or otherwise. And now we're handing them this straw, which basically tells them, hey, you know, cavalry is on the way. We already know how to measure biological age. We're all good. And hey, did you hear? Somebody said that the first person to live to 200 is already alive. And you know, Altos raised $3 billion. So, you know, if Yuri Milliner thinks that there's progress, I mean, you're all good. You can just go back to sleep. You don't have to awake to the fact that like you're going to become decrepit and dead, and all your loved ones are going to become decrepit and dead, and you know, nothing's being done about it really. You can just go back to sleep because biological age, we know how to measure that. And so I see that as extremely problematic. Those are my two big thoughts on this topic.
Yes, thank you, Adam. And I agree that any notions that would lead to people's complacency about the problem of aging, either in terms of them not thinking that it's a problem or in terms of them thinking that it will necessarily be solved without their active participation, I think those sources of complacency need to be challenged. And it is good to essentially display some skepticism about claims that we can, with some great degree of fidelity, but in some covert way, measure biological age so that, say, people who look like they're 80 can actually be 50, but we can't really tell the difference between them and other chronological 80-year-olds. I do think that if we have aging reversal, it would be quite obvious. Now, I will note there are people whom I have met who don't look their biological age. And I would say Liz Parrish is an example of that. Now, I don't have the wherewithal from a scientific perspective to say definitively that her biological age has been reversed, but she is, I believe, 52, and she does not look 52. But there are other people as well who haven't undertaken any protocols, as far as I'm aware, who do look much younger than their biological ages for some reason. So there is, I think, enough statistical variation in the general population that there are people whose biological age already is younger than their chronological age, but we don't really have a definitive protocol or a definitive way to measure that yet. That's my impression. I wanted to see if Ben Ballweg had a question for Adam.
I'll give it a whirl. Thanks for being here, Adam. I did email you a few days ago kind of to see if you would be willing to stand in defense of longevity states that were elsewhere from where I live. And like, what do I care if they're living healthy in Rhode Island? What's that do for me? And you did explain it pretty well today, but I wondered if you wanted to hit any other notes about here's why you should care about these longevity states going on elsewhere.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And I did see your email, and unfortunately, I didn't manage to get your response, but thank you for bringing that up here. So very briefly, I think that ultimately we all have our life circumstances. Some people can't move, some people have family situations, some people are in this or that financial circumstance, etc. And if we self-identify as vitalists, if we believe in the value that humanity should fight as hard as possible against aging and death, then that already puts us in the same boat philosophically. Now, the question is, what can one do about it given their circumstances? If we think that getting jurisdictional level influence is valuable, and one can't participate directly in getting that jurisdictional influence, or their jurisdiction is not a very conducive place to get influence, which may or may not be the case. Like even if you live in Wisconsin, for example, you might have a representative you may be able to influence, etc. There are other things that one could do, whether it's through spinning up an organization, doing things online, or creating a for-profit organization that promotes the message with media, the message that we should fight hard against aging and death, and potentially contributes to other initiatives. I do think that ultimately, if we succeed, it'll be a domino effect where certain jurisdictions which pave the way will become wealthier. They'll do better because they will have embraced the medicine of the 21st century, and ultimately other states will follow. So the faster we accelerate the formation of longevity states anywhere, the faster we will benefit in our own jurisdiction as well. So I know that that doesn't, solve everything directly for where somebody is in terms of the same impact or maybe the felt impact, but that would be my answer.
All right, thank you, Adam. And now let us see if Art Ramon has a question.
Yeah, thinking about what was said earlier about how younger people are valued more in society, and then they sort of age out and they're discarded. But there's sort of a double standard, because that doesn't seem to apply much to politicians or judges or some Hollywood actors or religious ministers. So I wonder, is there some way that we could maybe exploit that double standard and use it to bring about more vitalism policy?
That's a great question. I don't have a strong perspective on that. So I think it's useful to think about. I would love to get people who are older chronologically, like Tom Cruise or Arnold Schwarzenegger, who seems to be vitalist in his perspectives, to self-identify as part of this movement, self-identify with the philosophy and promote it. And I do think that having role models like that speak out, but also demonstrate that you should aspire to continue performing into later chronological age, in their case, really against the odds, is a useful thing. So if you have ideas on this, I'd love it if you could share them.
Yeah, I just sort of see that they're almost treated like a pseudo royalty, where you kind of allowed to serve until you die. So just kind of want to put that idea in your head and see if maybe you can think of something. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, that reminds me, when we're talking about these intentional communities, there's a lot of these ideas going around. The Venus Project, our friend Mike DeVerde has his agroforester group. I'm admin of this group, Off-Grid Transhumanist Community, and so there's this idea going around. And there's this other little project that I heard about where there will be people that have an elderly parent or something, and they don't want them to go into the nursing home. And so the child, of there is taking care of them. Well, when it's just one elderly person and one child, the bills are really tight. So there was this organization that would put like 2 or 3 of these people together, and then they would rent a house, and then between the 3 of them, 3 elderly people, the 3 children taking care of them, they were able to make the bills. There would always be somebody there to take care of all 3 and sort of share in the burden, and it strikes me that if we were to make a intentional community, we could have the elderly at a certain ratio to where we could take care of them right and have them in the center and give them the respect they deserve, to where, because when they're in the nursing home, I'm sure, it feels like they're thrown away. Well, we could, put them right in the center and honor them. They, include them in the whole voting process of the community. I mean, like you said, getting old, just like with these, the actors and all that, there's old people are still have, a lot, unless, they just went completely crazy, I guess. But, that's that's what we would keep from happening. And plus they would be right there, if we have the medical facility right in the center where the research is going on, they'd be right there for cryonics if the cryonics was to be involved. I just think, yeah, it would make me feel better if there was this intentional community that put the elderly at the center of it and honored them. That sounds like a cool thing. That's it.
Yes, thank you, Jason. And it is indeed an interesting concept. Of course, in older chronological ages, really, for many people, even starting in their 50s, survivability can be greatly improved just by having somebody around to respond to crisis situations. For many men in their 50s, for instance, heart attacks become quite common. And also, they become more prone to chronic diseases like cancer or diabetes, where it's really helpful to have someone nearby to respond to needs that, if they're satisfied, this person could be alive for decades longer with today's level of medical technology. But if they happen to just be on their own and some crisis occurs, they might die just because that time window for an effective response is missed. So I'm wondering, Adam, if you have any thoughts on this kind of approach as part of a vitalist strategy to keep people from dying while science arrives at effective ways to reverse their biological aging.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I'll just say that Vitalism does see these initiatives as valuable. I'll give one example, which is that there's an initiative started in the University of Newcastle by Professor Nick Palmerini, which is the Longevity City Initiative. And they're working with different cities, including, I believe, Lisbon, Barcelona, Tel Aviv, others, to establish models for what community/municipality would look like if it were optimizing for longevity of its inhabitants. And so from a vitalist perspective, those kind of initiatives are absolutely valuable and should be supported. And there could, I think, be many such organizations that self-identify as vitalists and would receive the support of our community. So in other words, yes, I totally agree with that. I think that today we have way too little thinking around innovative community and organization to support people's health span. So.
Yes, thank you, Adam. And I wanted to also get your thoughts on how organizations or individuals could become recognized as vitalist. Is it just a matter of self-identification, or is there any more formal process to follow, for instance, for vitalism.io to recognize another group as being vitalist?
Yeah, thank you. So of course, on an individual basis, any individual can self-identify as vitalist, and just like anybody can self-identify as liberal or conservative or any other self-designation or alignment with a philosophy. In terms of organizations, if you want to be self-identified, if you want to, promoting yourself as a vitalist organization, you would have to submit an application, and we're putting together form for this. It's not up yet, but it will be soon. And then that'll be evaluated by an assembly of recognized people in the longevity category from the sciences, entrepreneurship, philosophy, etc. And that will be brought to a vote, and organizations that get more than half the vote. And this will be transparent, meaning the members of such a voting body will be transparently identifying themselves. And that will define the designation. That designation will be a legal certification, meaning, as you may know, in trademark and wordmark law, an owner of a trademark or wordmark can delegate the right to use that self-identifying wordmark or trademark through certification, and that's what we're talking about.
Yes, thank you for that explanation, and we look forward to more information about that certification process that you described, because I'm sure that a number of organizations will be interested in following that path. So there is one more question that I hope we could address briefly, as we have a little less than 4 minutes. John H. wonders, with regard to progress in longevity science and technology, especially if it's aided by automation in the way that Mike Sin described, how fast could we integrate that level of progress in terms of perhaps making treatments available to the general population, ensuring that the culture will adjust in order to become more pro-longevity so that there isn't a lot of institutional resistance to the technology being deployed? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm sure that many people in the audience are going to hate what I'm going to say. I think it's going to take 15 to 20 years.
Interesting. And why do you think it would take that long?
Simply because having influence at that scale, and when you think about what it takes to bring even one intervention to market, and when you think about the speed at which movements kind of bring large amounts of influence to effect, just think about the climate change movement, which took 25, 30 years to get to the level that it is today, and other past movements. It just seems to be, to me, highly unlikely that we will be able to make massive progress within less than a decade. And so a rather optimistic timeline seems to me to be between 15 and 20 years. It could be sooner. Of course, I'd love for it to be sooner, but obviously devil's in the details too. I just want to get, sometimes people shy away from giving numbers, and I don't want to be that person. I want to give some ballpark numbers so people know at least what my mental model is. And those are numbers that I would quote.
Interesting. So would that be 15 to 20 years after the availability of the treatments, or at least after the time that they're technically feasible to achieve? Or could there be a kind of parallel movement where we could start to do the work now to achieve the acceptance and widespread deployment at the same time as the scientists are making progress toward the realization of age reversal?
Yeah, it's the latter. So I'd like to hope that we could do some of this in parallel.
All right. Thank you very much. And that is definitely my hope as well. And in the last minute of our salon, I'm curious if you have any concluding remarks, any points that you would like to make based on the discussion thus far, or anything else that you would wish to share with our viewers.
Absolutely. So thank you. I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to be with you all, and thanks a lot, Gennady, for both inviting me and emceeing and organizing and carrying on the interview. I just want to say that I'm also just very grateful that there are other people who share these values and who are part of this community, who do want to work together and collaborate to make this vision a reality, at least the vision of defeating aging and death. Whether they might have some different perspectives on it, but I think many of us could unite in some way, and I'd like to think that Vitalism could be that way. And I'd also just want to say that I am a staunch optimist, and I think that regardless of what the odds are, if we try really hard, we might get a good outcome, and we absolutely should, because life is such an incredible miracle, and we've seen so little of it, and we understand so little of it. So I'd like to just encourage all of us to band together and try to make these dreams a reality.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you very much, Adam, for these inspiring words. Hopefully, with today's salon, we have motivated more people to look into vitalism, take part in this movement, and really, we need all the help we can get in order to hopefully defeat death within our lifetime. So, thank you to our audience. Thank you to our panelists, and thank you to Adam for joining us. I hope that we can all live long and prosper.